Thank you, Dr. Wagner. I'm going to share my screen with you all so that you can follow along with me. This PowerPoint is really more about, can y'all see that? Is that up? Okay, yeah, I can see it in the back there. This is really more about following the flow of thought in the paper. And so hopefully it'll help you do that. The first part of this is going to be a little bit heady, so just bear with me and try to get as much out of that as you can. And then as we move to the end of the paper, we'll talk about how this applies to our ministry context and those kinds of things. And I think that's where we may even have some more fruitful dialogue after this paper. So let me dig in here at the beginning, and yeah, you can follow along as I go through the slides. Okay, as Dr. Wagner mentioned, this is Rooted and Renewed, Retrieving Eucharistic Prayers for Evangelical Baptist Worship. Evangelical Baptist churches have long been characterized by a commitment to freedom of form and spontaneity in their corporate worship services. While many other denominations have prayer books and more formalized liturgical structures, Baptists have rightly relied on the biblical text as the primary guide for worship practices, famously claiming the idiomatic statement, "No creed but the Bible." Although this sentiment is laudable, an over-realized commitment to worship built upon the Bible may lead Baptist churches to forfeit a richness in worship by ignoring the historic liturgies of the church. Recently, a growing number of Baptist scholarship has sought to retrieve aspects of historical theology and liturgical practices without abandoning a commitment to sola scriptura and other distinctly Baptist convictions. Many facets of church history can be evaluated for Baptist renewal, and one of these resources is the liturgical worship practices of the early church. Specifically, early church documents offer modern scholars of liturgy primary source material to consider, analyze, and appropriate into worship practices today that can enrich our Christian worship. Within this broad category are the Eucharistic prayers of the early church. These prayers offer a picture of the beliefs and practices of the early church around one of the most important events in Christian worship, the Lord's Supper. So through a liturgical retrieval methodology, Evangelical Baptists can detect from these patristic prayers a historical rootedness and develop a richer appreciation of the Lord's Supper without abandoning historic Baptist convictions and practices. In this presentation, I'll use a liturgical retrieval method to evaluate the Eucharistic prayers of two essential documents from the early post-apostolic era, namely the Didache and the Apostolic Traditions. This presentation will also offer a theological and pragmatic appropriation of historical ideas from these prayers. Although brief, I hope in the end we can all feel a greater historical rootedness to our own Evangelical Baptist worship practices. The methods of liturgical retrieval and liturgical theology are similar in that they both seek to understand material of the past in its original context. The main difference between these two methods is the point at which each ends. Theological retrieval seeks to appropriate theological conclusions of the past into the present. Liturgical theology seeks to give a theological basis to the explanation of past worship practices. So if we combine these two methods, it makes it possible to have a liturgical theology that seeks to retrieve past liturgical elements and appropriate them to present practices and ideologies for the purpose of worship, rootedness, and renewal. So to accomplish this, we'll take 4 steps. First, it's necessary to choose a liturgical element from the past that can provide a resource that might inform current worship practices. This presentation will consider the Eucharistic prayers, again, of the Didache and the Apostolic Tradition. Second, is to do a historical analysis of these prayers in the context of the larger work. This step intends to place liturgical elements in the context in which they were developed and practiced so that a complete and honest understanding can be grasped. Step 3 works towards a theological synthesis of the historical observations made in the previous step. This synthesis yields the primary material that can then be transferred into the final step of appropriation. Thus, the final step is appropriating the analytical and theological findings into current liturgical practices. The Didache and the Apostolic Tradition are two of the oldest documents dealing with church order after the New Testament. Additionally, the text of these two documents proves highly influential in their respected regions. Paul Bradshaw argues this point of the apostolic tradition, stating, although some scholars still entertain doubts about its attribution to Hippolytus or its Roman origin, it is now universally accepted that this document is the original source of the other church orders from which it was formerly presumed to be derived. The same is true of the Didache's influence in the East. The Didache serves as a window into the life of the earliest Christians, the community's self-identity, and related problems surrounding a nascent apostolic period. Thus, both ancient documents shaped the worship practices of the early church and provide significant resources to mine for appropriation into current worship practices. Discovered in 1873, the teaching of the Lord to the Gentiles through the 12 apostles has come to be known as the Didache. While this document has been studied in many ways, it is not without its difficulties to overcome. Specifically, beliefs over genre, dating, and geographical origin of the work lack a unified consensus. To understand the context of the Didache and evaluate its resources for appropriation, determining the genre of the book is an important task. In its fuller title, it claims for itself to be a book of apostolic teachings for Gentiles. Scholars have sought to narrow this idea to a church order, a community order, or a church manual. They've continued to debate genre, but for this paper, it's most important to discern whether the Didache influenced the corporate worship practices of the church. Fortunately, this would be a reasonable conclusion within any of the disputed genres. Niederweimer offers a more direct observation locating the Didache as a book of praxis when he states, the Didache is not a theological work, but a rule for ecclesiastical practice, a handbook of church morals, rituals, and discipline. Again, this summary statement allows for any of the theories of genre to acceptably fit within its parameters. A second important issue is the dating of the document. The Didache is widely accepted as an early church document. The latest common dating places the document in the late 2nd century. The earliest places it around AD 80. In either case, it's one of the earliest extant documents of church history. And this is significant for this case, for this study, since its early dating allows for the document to influence the early church significantly. Bradshaw theorizes that the Didache significantly influenced other early church documents like the Apostolic Church Order and the Apostolic Constitutions. Finally, the geographical origin of the Didache is also debated and equally difficult to determine. In examining the internal evidence, the origin appears to be Syrian. This is due to the use of Matthean-type gospel tradition and the ministry of wandering prophets and teachings. However, the external evidence suggests that Egypt may be a more likely place of origin. This is due primarily to the lack of conclusive parallels in Ignatius of Antioch or in Theophilus, and the fact that later use of the Didache and the earliest textual evidence point rather to Egypt. Locating the Didache in its proper geographic context is widely known to be a difficult task. What is more certain is the general audience that it was intended for and why it was written. Most simply, we can state that this was a document written for early believers struggling with pre-Constantine persecution, that they might have instructions on how to operate as a church. We consider next the apostolic tradition, which has many of the same issues as the Didache regarding its genre, dating, and geographical origin, though there seems to be more consensus among scholars. Since the time of its discovery in the early 20th century, the document has been widely accepted as the original source of the other church orders from which it was formerly presumed to derive from. Its dating should almost certainly be later than the Didache, but only slightly. Bradshaw again observes, the majority of scholars have supported the view that it originated from Rome and is the genuine work of Hippolytus, written circa 215. But this is far from sure. Specifically related to authorship, recent scholarship led by Marcel Metzger has cast doubt on the majority position, offering instead the idea that Hippolytus nor any other single individual wrote this document. Instead, Metzger and other scholars believe it's more plausibly a collection of community rules from quite disparate traditions. Bradshaw also holds this view and advises that the study of this document should be done at an elemental level and not taken as one coherent document. Therefore, Bradshaw and other recent scholars do not allow these issues to cause undervaluing of the ancient text. Instead, he allows these issues to shape how these texts are studied. This presentation strives to do the same by considering the Eucharistic prayers in isolation from the rest of the text. Apostolic tradition is thus a multi-layered work representing both ancient tradition and social struggles of a Roman community in the 3rd century. Despite some difficulties and disagreements over the origin of the Didache and the apostolic tradition, the idea that these documents were influential in early church is hard to dispute. This brief historical analysis concludes that both documents were pre-Constantinian church manuals that outlined some of the liturgical practices of the early church. Although early Christian worship was culturally, linguistically, geographically, and theologically diverse, it is possible to arrive at general conclusions considering these worship practices. In order to do this, the most reliable resources prove to be documents like the Didache and the apostolic traditions. A complete theological analysis of the prayers of these two texts would require a lengthy study, which I'll spare you from today. For this presentation, a general theological survey of each to evaluate where there is agreement between the two documents will suffice in giving some significant concepts that can then be appropriated into evangelical Baptist worship practices centered around the Lord's Supper. So first, we'll consider the Didache. The Eucharistic prayers in the Didache occur in the 3rd section, often thought of as a section on Christian rituals. Along with the Eucharistic prayers, Noah Kelly states that the rituals of the Didache include instruction for abstaining from meat sacrificed to idols, and properly practicing baptism, prayer, fasting, and the communal meal. Within the context of ritual instruction, however, the prayers have been referred to as a high point in the Didache. Sean Wilhite summarizes the elements of this prayer, stating, regardless of how someone may historically reconstruct this communal event, the Eucharist involves the two elements administered by Jesus in the upper room, an expression of thanksgiving, liturgical prayers associated with the cup, bread, and meal, and a large meal to satisfy the hunger of the communal gathering. Although many of the expected elements of the Lord's Supper are present, one is alarmingly absent. Larson describes the omission of the words of institution as the elephant that's not in the room, and even more shockingly points out the Eucharistic prayers in Didache 9 and 10, like any reference to the death of Jesus Christ whatsoever. Since this presentation is concerned exclusively with thematic agreement between these two documents, this omission will significantly limit themes of atonement and redemption that are often prominent in the Lord's Supper. In the apostolic tradition, there exist two Eucharistic moments. One falls in the context of the ordination of a bishop and contains the words to be prayed at the time of the Eucharist. It begins, quote, when he has been made bishop, end quote, and then proceeds to move into the prayer. The second is found after a baptism and is more instructive on the order of events within the liturgy. Both moments should be considered in arriving at a theological synthesis of the Eucharistic contents of the apostolic tradition. Unlike the Didache, apostolic tradition focuses more explicitly on the life and work of Christ, making more direct connection with his death and resurrection. The first central theological theme evident in both of is their commitment to the idea of thanksgiving. In the Didache, the Eucharistic prayers can be divided into two sections. those prayed before and those prayed after the meal. Each prayer is introduced with a similar syntactical construction: Eucharistomen, su, patera hemon, or we give you thanks, our Father. This denotes an overarching purpose for these prayers and the liturgical act itself. Further evidence of thanksgiving is found in the frequent use with which the Didache uses Eucharistomen and the noun form Eucharistos, conveying a sense of the significance of thanks in its prayer language. The verbal and imperatival forms of Eucharistoo denote the sense of give thanks, while the noun form should be understood as the observance and elements of the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. It should be noted that this interpretation of Eucharistos leads to the understanding that the meal taking place is not an agape meal, as some have argued, but is instead the liturgical ritual of the Lord's Supper. The idea of thanksgiving is also consistent with the Eucharistic prayers in the apostolic tradition. While the word thanksgiving is not repeated or emphasized as often in the Didache, the idea of thanksgiving is communicated through similar syntactical constructions. After a brief responsive prayer, the bishop begins a more extended prayer of thanksgiving stated, "We give thanks to you, God." As the beginning of the bishop's prayer, this statement frames the following words as fundamentally a prayer of thanksgiving. Additionally, the instruction before the responsive prayer reads, quote, "Let the deacon present the oblation to him, and laying hands on it with the whole presbytery, let him say, giving thanks, the Lord be with you," end quote. Therefore, it should be concluded that the posture of prayer in the apostolic tradition's Eucharist is one of thanksgiving, much like that found in the Didache. While each of these texts communicates the importance of thanksgiving differently, they highlight the importance of this disposition of the worshiper who have gathered to take the Eucharist together. They are to be thankful. A second theological theme seen in both prayers is that of divine presence. This is seen primarily in the context of the first theme of thanksgiving just considered. The introductory statement of the apostolic tradition's responsive prayer states, "The Lord be with you." Additionally, this prayer also mentions the sending of the Son to be the Savior and Redeemer, as well as the sending of the Holy Spirit to empower the church. Central to the prayer of the apostolic tradition is the effort to acknowledge God's presence with his people, as well as pray for a continuation of that presence for the purpose of unifying the church and providing the physical and spiritual nourishment each believer requires. The Didache also, in the context of thanksgiving, points to the reality of God's presence, actively working in the Eucharist. It states, "We give you thanks, Holy Father, for your holy name, which you have caused to dwell in our hearts, and for the knowledge and faith and immortality that you have made known to us through Jesus, your servant. To you be the glory forever." The idea of God causing his holy name to dwell in the hearts of those praying communicates the idea of God's sustaining presence. The prayer is an opportunity for worshipers to be reminded that God is with them. Third, both church orders emphasize and assume an ecclesial unity, albeit in different ways. The Didache infers this idea through the instruction that only those who have been baptized should partake of the Lord's Supper. But let no one eat or drink of the Eucharist except those who have been baptized into the name of the Lord. For the Lord has also spoken concerning this. Do not give what is holy to dogs. This directive indicates a need for those participating in the Eucharist to have committed to the people of God as evidenced through the public act of baptism. The apostolic tradition emphasizes unity and an awareness of the gathered people more directly with responsive prayers. Additionally, both prayers consistently use plural pronouns throughout, bringing a greater awareness of those gathered as one body. In considering the patristic era's Eucharistic theology and the necessity of the assembly, Alexander Schmemann writes, quote, "Thus, from the very beginning, we can see an obvious, undoubted triunity of the assembly, the Eucharist, and the universal church, to which the whole early tradition of the church, following St. Paul, unanimously testifies." The gathering of the church and its active corporate participation was a key feature of Eucharistic worship. These three theological observations of the Eucharistic prayers can be synthesized into a simple theological conclusion, namely, that this meal was a liturgical moment of worship that focused on giving thanks to God for his provision through his divine presence in the context of a unified church. Appropriation. Reflection on the analysis of these Eucharistic prayers reveals several connecting points for Evangelical Baptists and these ancient prayers. First, Evangelical Baptists can rejoice to see that the fencing of the table in these early prayers demonstrates a serious commitment to what has been called close communion. This I title as a theme of continuity or rootedness. In speaking of the church as essentially Eucharistic, Simon Chan offers some consensus stating the early church understood this principle by restricting the communion meal to believers who are baptized and in good standing with the church. This is evidenced in the early church by their not allowing the catechumens, those who had not been baptized, to participate in the Eucharist. Southern Baptists hold a similar position to that found in these ancient prayers. The Baptist Faith and Message 2000, the most recent confessional document of the Southern Baptist Convention, clearly states that those who wish to take communion should be baptized believers. Although there are nearly 2,000 years between the Eucharistic practices of the early church and the Baptist Faith and Message 2000, consistency can be observed that should remind Southern Baptists that they are connected to the ancient church. Not only do these ancient prayers provide opportunities for developing a rootedness to the past, they also encourage the renewal of practice and thought. One idea of these prayers contributes to the renewal of current Lord's Supper practice is the theme of thanksgiving found in both. This disposition gives an example of the proper heart attitude as the church received the Lord's Supper long ago. In a contemporary context, questions often arise during the Lord's Supper related to the tone of the liturgical act. Should it be an event of somber or sorrowful remembrance as the church mourns the sacrificial death Christ died so long ago? Should it be a celebration as the people of God remember Jesus Christ risen from the dead and look forward to a future eschatological meal? Should it be a mixture of both dispositions? These ancient prayers instruct contemporary worship in the way of simplicity as they remind worshipers of the value of being thankful. The thankfulness in these prayers has no boundaries. In the Didache, section 10.7, it states, "Permit the prophets to give thanks however they wish." Evangelical Baptists and all who celebrate the Lord's Supper in a worthy manner should renew their focus during the Lord's Supper to be primarily an attitude of thankfulness to God for what he has done, is doing, and will do in Christ Jesus. A second point of renewal is found in the assumption in both these prayers that the Eucharist is a liturgical event to be done in community. There may be a temptation in some practices of the Lord's Supper to turn the meal into a personal opportunity of worship as individuals look to their vertical relationship with God to the neglect of the horizontal relationship they share with their brothers and sisters. Advocating for this principle in Baptist worship, Sean Wright states, quote, "As we look around and see brothers and sisters eating the supper with us, we are reminded that we are part of the family of the church. We are not on our own, but are members of a body of believers whom Christ has also redeemed." Through responsive praying, corporate language, and the prayers offered by the bishop, and awareness of membership, the early church's practice intentionally oriented itself towards a mindfulness of one another and the cultivation of deeper Christian fellowship. The Lord's Supper is a family meal meant to be taken with one another when the church comes together, and the patristic prayers advocate for the importance of the unity of the church. A third theological theme from these prayers providing opportunity for renewal is the importance of God's presence in the Eucharist. Reacting to the sacramental abuses of the medieval church, the Reformation saw a rejection of ideas that the physical person of Christ was present in the Eucharist. Some have subscribed to a spiritual presence view instead, while others have rejected the presence of Christ almost entirely. Beyond the Reformation, Robert Weber places the blame of evangelical abandonment of the presence of God at the feet of the Enlightenment when he states, quote, "The primary way to see the crisis at table worship is to place it in the larger process of the desupernaturalization of the entire Christian story at the hands of the Enlightenment rationalism. This is a condition which the patristic liturgies can help us remedy, as these liturgies are unaffected by Enlightenment rationalism. Instead, the Lord's Supper has become a time when the individual worshiper is expected to do something, remember. However, the patristic Eucharistic prayers also understood that God was doing something to the worshiper as well. Specifically, these early Eucharistic prayers direct the worshiper to consider God's presence through his provision, both physically and spiritually. Additionally, they point to his presence in the growing unity of the church as it meets together around the family table. To conclude, through a closer look at the Eucharistic prayers of the Didache and the apostolic tradition, evangelical Baptists can retrieve and appropriate theological and practical principles into a way of understanding the Lord's Supper that is rooted in historical practices much older than the Reformation. Additionally, a renewal and richness in the Lord's Supper can also be arrived at through appropriation of these historic practices. This presentation only scratches the surface of the possibilities for evangelical Baptists to do the work of liturgical retrieval for the sake of rootedness and renewal. Perhaps Gavin Ortlund best articulates the value and purpose of this approach, stating, "Liturgical retrieval is better understood as a set of shared loyalties or instincts in theological method, an overall attitude guided by the conviction that pre-modern resources are not an obstacle in the age of progress, but a well in the age of thirst." May evangelical Baptists continue to pursue the well of historical rootedness, richness, and by doing so, root worship in the ancient ways of the church and renew worship with the voices from the past.